a conversation on Asians for Black Lives. Sorry that we got started a bit late. There were some technical issues, but to save time, the format is going to be as follows. So we're going to have an hour and 15 minutes to discuss some of the questions I prepared. And then I'm going to leave 15 minutes for questions, and you can ask through Twitter using the hashtag Asians for Black Lives with the number 4. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at 18 Million Rising. So let's jump into some really quick intros. My name is Diane Wong, and I'm currently the social media wizard for 18 Million Rising. I'm also a PhD candidate in political science at Cornell, and I write on race, gender, and gentrifications of Chinatown. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves and the organizations that they represent. So Fahad, do you want to go first?
Sure. Greetings. My name is Fahad Edmonds. I work with Drum Daisies Rising Up and Moving. We organize working class South Asian immigrants, workers, and youth in New York City on immigrant rights, worker rights, police accountability, educational justice, and global justice. Happy to be here.
Fresco, do you want to go next?
Hey everyone, my name is Fresco. I work with the Black Youth Project 100. BYP 100 is a national organization of young folks between the ages of 18 and 35, working on Black liberation and decriminalizing Black identity all over the country.
Joo Hyun?
Hi, I'm Joo Hyun with Communities United for Police Reform. We're a campaign to end discriminatory and abusive policing in New York with organizational members across the city, including Drum and CAAAV, who are on this call.
Thank you. And Oyan?
Hi everyone, Oyan Poon. I am an assistant professor of higher education at Loyola University Chicago. My work is on the racial politics of college access, educational access, and Asian Americans.
All right, and Mijin.
Hi, my name is Mijin. I'm with CAAAV. I'm a member volunteer of CAAAV, Organizing Asian Communities. We are a grassroots organization that builds the power of low-income Pan-Asian communities, building racial and economic justice. We've also been working closely with the family of Akai Gurley recently.
So thanks everyone. Really excited to have this conversation. And so before we jump into the questions that I have, I do want to give some important background on the hashtag Asians for Black Lives. The hashtag was started by a group in the Bay Area with the name Asians for Black Lives that joined Black-led organizations to shut down the Oakland Police Department in December of 2014. And their statement reads, we are a group of Asians putting our bodies on the line in response to a national call to shut down institutions that perpetuate the war on Black people. So this conversation is independent of the Bay Area-based organization, but we are grateful to them for encapsulating Asian American support for Black liberation in the hashtag and especially on the ground. And so we hope that this is the first of several Google Hangout conversations that we have on the topic. And this Hangout has prioritized New York City-based organizations in order to center sort of what has been going on around the Peter Liang trial. But in future conversations, we do want to include the perspectives of other groups who are doing really great work. And I also do want to give some introduction on sort of, for those who haven't been following us closely on the Peter Liang trial, what has been going on. So on October 20th, 2014, Officer Peter Liang shot and killed Akai Gurley, an unarmed Black 28-year-old father in pink houses, Brooklyn, New York. Hundreds of Asian Americans across the country mobilized in support of Akai Gurley and his family in light of the alarming number of unarmed Black men, boys, girls, and women being murdered by the police. And in February 2015, Officer Liang was indicted by a grand jury for the shooting death of Akai Gurley. And last Thursday, on February 11th, 2016, a 12-person jury at the Brooklyn Supreme Court convicted Liang of manslaughter as well as official misconduct. So Liang's sentencing will be on April 14th, and he faces the possibility of no jail time and a probation up to 15 years in prison. So since the jury's decision, however, that has been harassment directed towards CAAAV, Organizing Asian Communities, and other Asians who have been mobilizing for police accountability and broader racial justice in the wake of Akai Gurley's death. The ethnic Chinese media has also pushed a kind of polarizing and anti-Black narrative around the conviction of Peter Liang. So this has caused a lot of strain within the larger Asian American community, and we've received a number of requests to help reframe and recenter the conversation. So today we hope to have an open and honest dialogue about police violence, interracial solidarity, organizing, and what Asians for Black Lives looks like in practice on the ground in New York City and beyond. So with that, let's jump into questions that I have for the panelists. So the first one is, so many Liang supporters are framing Peter Liang's trial and conviction as an Asian American civil rights issue. An organization calling itself Coalition for Asian American Civil Rights emerged to rally for Peter Liang and have even evoked the murder of Vincent Chin in relation to what they see as the scapegoating of Liang. Why do you think that some members of the Asian American community are mobilizing around Peter Liang while remaining disengaged in other Asian American civil rights issues, for example, the police beating of Kang Wang in New York City's Chinatown? And so this question goes out to everyone, but I know that especially CAAAV has been working closely in the New York City context. So, yeah.
Okay, I think I'll take that one first. So I think it's interesting especially I actually hadn't heard folks evoking the Vincent Chin narrative, but that's interesting because that's actually something that CAAAV also sees as an example of state violence. So despite the fact that it was not necessarily police officers, it was two white men who killed Vincent Chin, and then it was the state that, in that case, it was the judge who decided that because they were, these white men who essentially killed Vincent Chin were upstanding citizens, that they should not have to serve any jail time. I think they got it was 3 months probation and I think $500 fines or something like that. So I think that actually goes very much along the lines of why CAAAV is standing with not just other Asian communities and not just the family of Akai Gurley, but also with Black communities who have been along with us all along the way. So yeah, I think I'll stop there and let others kind of respond.
I think to your question of why this particular issue, why the Peter Liang case and why not other cases like the elderly gentleman in New York, and here in Chicago you have the Jessica Klesick case of a year ago. I think that part of it is that there's a misplaced anger, certainly guided by an anti-Black racism amongst the community, and particularly amongst what I've observed among these particular Chinese American immigrants coming from a particular higher class standing, professional status, more highly educated, and I would say a more recent immigrant population that was privileged in the immigration system, first of all, to be allowed to come here given their professional and educated class statuses. These are, from what I've observed in going through a lot of their websites and their materials, they seem to really hold tight to the idea of following rules, and Peter Liang in particular, certainly as a police officer, embodies, right, laws and rules. And for them, the narrative is you follow the rules, you do what you're supposed to do, and you will reap rewards of essentially whiteness, right? And in understanding the history of this nation, whiteness equates to citizenship, equates to humanness and human rights. And so what they're pissed about here is that there certainly is an injustice that not all officers are held accountable for violence and brutality and murder, but somehow along the way, this group of Chinese Americans has concluded that the solution then is that Chinese Americans and Asian Americans should be able to access the privileges of whiteness, rather than I think what we all here are talking about is transforming the system so that we don't have cases like this where police, the state, is held unaccountable for the murder of innocent, unarmed people.
If I could add on to that same point, I work with Drum, Daisy Rising Up and Moving, and we organize in working class South Asian communities. And in our community, there's been the issue of the spying on Muslim communities and South Asian communities that's very much been in the media, particularly the last 3 years, but it has been an ongoing issue for the last 14 years. And the spying on the community is being carried out by officers from within our own community. And we have, very similarly, a same set of community leaders, quote unquote, largely from privileged backgrounds, often business owners, faith leaders, and professionals, who, despite this happening, still continue to promote the idea of, oh, we just need more officers from our community within these power structures, who invite law enforcement into the community and promote them, even very literally pushing out congregants who have been targeted by law enforcement. And so there's very much a, class is, while not fully determinative, but does very strongly influence how people see the systems that exist around them, what sort of interests they have, and then that sets what sort of agendas they have. And by and large, privileged classes are a lot more interested in being closer to the sources of power, and that's why for a lot of us it's important. It reiterates the necessity of organizing working class communities and building working class leadership.
This is Joo Hyun. I just also I agree with what folks have said largely, and I also just want to add that part of the situation right now is that we've got a context where people looking at the case of the killing of Akai Gurley by Peter Liang, this is the first time many people around the country, including in New York City, have seen a police officer held accountable for anything at any level. And so part of it is also there's an assumption that if you're an officer, you shouldn't have to be held accountable to the law. So I think we've just got to include, in addition to the analysis that's been put out around race and how certain segments of the Asian community are trying to access white privilege, and that is counter to what we're trying to do in terms of ending white supremacy. The other piece of it is that regardless of the race of the officer, law enforcement across the country consistently get away with literally murder and killing. And the last time in New York City that we saw any officer convicted for killing a person was over 10 years ago. That officer received no time as their sentence. And so the next stage in terms of looking at what happens with Peter Liang is really looking at the sentencing period in mid-April.
So we have a couple new folks who just joined in, so I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves again once I ask the next question, which is really related to everything that's been said already, right? So many Asian Americans are exposed to language and analysis around concepts like solidarity, anti-Blackness, and the model minority myth in relation to the context of higher education, English language textbooks, articles, blog posts, and other platforms that may be less accessible to some members in our communities depending on English level proficiency, socioeconomic status, immigration status, age, etc. So how can we make sure that our solidarity work is articulated and practiced in ways that are accessible and also relevant to everyone? Right. So thinking about what are some ways that we can communicate these concepts, not just in Chinese, but various Asian languages and beyond Asian languages, either directly or via translation. So I know that, right, CAAAV does a lot of work with Chinese working class tenants and also folks living in the Chinatown area, and has been doing a lot of work around language justice. Can you speak a little bit on that and sort of ways that you have been able to communicate and to articulate concepts like, right, anti-Blackness, model minority, and things like that to the folks you work with and your members?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality, kind of my initial thinking, the response to this question is like, how can we make sure that, you know, solidarity is happening? I think there's a very basic kind of concept of like people have the right to live. You know, it's a very, very basic human right, and you know, Akai Gurley deserved or had the right to his life, and that was taken away. And I think in terms of kind of like communicating that to our base of folks who are, you know, also having their own human rights violated in different ways, right? Like their right to, in Chinatown, for example, folks are being kicked out of their homes because of, you know, landlords who are selling properties off to be able to gain a profit. And so I think when it's in people's like daily lives, or when they're experiencing it in these different ways, the message is much clearer. And I think that a little bit of a struggle is to communicate that to folks who are not experiencing, who are maybe not experiencing the like the impact in terms of like on their family and stuff like that as directly. And I think, yeah, so I don't know if I have like a super clear answer about how we are doing that. I think for us it's much more about practicing it, right? That it's not like the issue of Akai Gurley's life being stolen. It's actually not about us as Asian communities in terms of, you know, we're not at the center. We're not the ones whose voice needs to be amplified. That is, you know, Akai's family is the ones whose voices we're really trying to center and amplify. And for us to be like Asian faces and we're showing our solidarity by putting in work, and also not necessarily seeing ourselves at like the center of this struggle as Asian community.
And I know that you do a lot of work with South Asian communities, but have you encountered any kind of, do you have any language access or programs that help, I guess, folks in your community, especially based out in Queens, to better understand, right, what's going on around the police and accountability, and sort of building the language that you can communicate to folks who are maybe elderly, who don't really aren't fluent in English at all?
Yeah. So, you know, like our work is around immigrant rights. We also do work around the school to prison pipeline, worker rights, and police accountability. Our community is very much impacted by police abuse, both through the surveillance of our communities, but also in working class sections of our community. There is a high level of police presence, so street policing. But we don't face anywhere near the violence and the brutality that Black communities and many Latino communities face. And we clearly understand that. And because there's that difference, often you see that there is even communities internally sort of try to separate it out and say like, oh, no, those are the communities, they face violence more because they are violent, or they are this, or they are that. And I think for us, I'm not sure how much we're engaging in converse around using the words model minority, but I think there's different ways to get into those conversations. And for us, the question is around, if we're attempting to build solidarity, where is it that we're attempting to build solidarity, and with whom within our communities? And for us, the directive is clear that it has to be with our organized mass spaces and with the marginalized sections of our communities. So the undocumented immigrant, the low-wage workers, the cab drivers, the street vendors, the young South Asian kid that's been stopped and frisked 17 times, the mother whose son is serving 30 years in prison because they were targeted by the NYPD surveillance and are now serving 30 years in prison. And there's two ways that we go about this. One is being very intentional about doing deep political education with our membership base, and doing it in an open way that allows there to be debates, that allows there to be disagreements, but is also contextualized with history, with understandings of how things came to be the way that they are. And the second is really doing very intentional relationship building across other mass spaces. And so a lot of the families that have lost their loved ones to NYPD violence are organized by Justice Committee in New York City. And a lot of our members have relationships and have met with the mothers. And so Shahina, whose son was entrapped by the NYPD, knows a lot of the mothers that work with Justice Committee. And because they're able to build relationships, they're able to build solidarity in flesh. When she comes back to the organization and comes back into the community, she becomes somebody that really takes on those struggles and is able to link those struggles to the struggles of our communities. And that it's a solidarity that's not just about sort of declaring it, but it also starts to shape how people think about their own struggles. And so how do we achieve justice in a way that doesn't throw other communities underneath the bus, that doesn't marginalize other communities, but is inclusive of all other communities and their respective struggles.
So in terms of what has been going on in New York City, right? CAAAV was one of the first Asian American organizations to publicly support justice for Akai Gurley, and they have been working closely with the family. The organization, along with its staff members, are now being harassed by pro-Liang supporters through various forms of online harassment and threats. And it really does break me to see many people I know in my own community resorting to this kind of violence, right? And to me, I think that signals how deep anti-Blackness runs in our communities and homes. So this question goes out to everyone. What do you think is a source of anti-Blackness in Asian American communities? Is it just white supremacy in the context of where we are in so-called America? Or do you think that it's more complicated than that? So thinking about how a lot of Asian immigrants and refugees often come here with their own baggage of colorism and anti-Blackness. Yeah.
I guess I'll lead that one off. So I do want to kind of nuance or complicate the anti-Blackness conversation, because I think obviously that does exist in, like I'll speak for myself, in Korean and Chinese communities. And also I think that, you know, CAAAV kind of like took a look back and we realized that a lot of the folks who are going, so for example, there's nationwide rallies. I saw someone just ask a question in support of Peter Liang happening tomorrow, which is why I think, Diane, part of the reason why the timing of this conversation is today. And I think a lot of that is also about outreach via, you know, whether it's Chinese media, Chinese language media, whether it's WeChat, or, you know, different ways in which, you know, Chinese-speaking folks are getting their information. A lot of our information has gone out in English, and to, you know, like places like Facebook and social media that is more accessible to English-speaking folks. And so I think the more nuanced arguments, or the more, you know, kind of the perspective of Akai's family is possibly not as accessible, right, to these Chinese communities who are rallying in support of Peter Liang. So I want to say, like, yes, anti-Black racism, and also like what, and so I think your previous question was important, and one that I couldn't answer really fully is like, what is the outreach looking like towards communities who, you know, have very strong feelings about, especially about like the Peter Liang, you know, conversation. And I think, yeah, I think I'm losing my train of thought, so I'll stop there.
if I can give a little bit of historical context, you know, I just recently gave a workshops for some students on Asian American history, and something that the students noted and observed was how much resistance to racism by Asian Americans seems to go according to kind of a fork in the road choice of either option A of working with other people of color in solidarity for transformative justice. So for instance, the Delano grape strikes, where Filipino Americans worked with Chicano farm workers and Cesar Chavez in particular, and Dolores Huerta, and founded the United Farm Workers movement, or even within higher education, the ethnic studies movement, in bilingual education with the Lau v. Nichols case, right? These were all cases that, sure, were Asian Americans were part of it, were in leadership, but it was about transforming the system, right? So that's like option A. Option B, unfortunately, has also been very present, which is this choice to try to gain whiteness, like I said earlier. So you have cases like the Ozawa Supreme Court case or the Thind Supreme Court case in the 1920s, where people who are neither black nor white were not legally allowed U.S. citizenship. And so Ozawa and Thind went to court and said, well, you know what, I think we're white. And so we deserve U.S. citizenship and all the rights that go along with that. They didn't argue that they were black, which is also, you know, that was an option in those cases too, but they didn't. Which says something about the long history of anti-blackness and the conflict there. In education, you also had a case, the Lum case in Mississippi, where Asian children, Chinese child, in this particular case, was denied access to public schools, was told to go to the colored school, and so the family sued to go to the white school. The court, again, in that case said, you know what, you're not white, right? So you have these multiple cases of, and I think with the Liang supporters, you again have this choice that Asian Americans have been are making to want whiteness, to gain legal claim to whiteness. And, you know, I was struggling with that question of, like, is it as simple as anti-blackness, or is it more complicated? I mean, surely it's more complicated, but at this point in my thinking, I'm thinking that because anti-blackness is so fundamental and foundational to white supremacy in the United States, that's why, you know, how many times do people say, like, oh, Americans, and what they really mean is white people, right? There's a historical legacy to that contextualized meaning. Americanness is citizenship, is full human rights, and it's totally intertwined with white supremacy, which again, it goes back to anti-blackness. So yeah, so I'll just leave it there for now.
Yeah, I think that that historical context is so important, and I think that this case is so layered, which is why a lot of folks have sort of been confused about how to build an analysis around what has been going around Peter Liang's conviction, and also ways to think about the murder of Akai Gurley, right? And so I think that a lot of conversations also lead to thinking about the ways in which anti-Black racism differently affects Asian communities, right? So thinking specifically about South Asian and East Asian communities, and I'm wondering if you know, any of you have thoughts on that.
So, Fresco here with PYP 100. I want to, like, I guess, complicate or nuance this idea that that anti-Blackness is this simple, is like simple at all, and to say anti-Blackness is simple is in a sense anti-Black. But this idea that anti-Blackness is very layered. Anti-Blackness does not stop with America, and anti-Blackness is disconnected from white supremacy. And so when we talk about anti-Blackness, we're not only talking about the ways in which Asian American folks have historically accessed whiteness and pushed themselves away from Blackness in order to gain access and power and move up a ladder of power and access, a ladder that Black folks all across this country and all across this world will never, ever be able to access. We're also talking about a historical context where every country, culture, and group of folks in this entire world have a history where they've participated in the structural enslavement of Black people. And so when we talk about anti-Blackness, it doesn't begin when Asian American folks or any non-Black immigrants get to this country. It starts in every single country except the Polynesian cultures, that being the only group that has not participated in structural enslavement of and chattel slavery of Black folks. And so yeah, so I think that when you dig into like the anti-Blackness of Asian American folks, you leave 80% of that story untold if you tell the narrative that anti-Blackness or white supremacy that was cultured in this country and by the white supremacy of America, and not in the history of folks' own cultures and the way that they have sustained themselves and supported their communities and their social structures on the backs of Black folks throughout centuries.
Yeah, I think that's super important to keep in mind, right? That historical global context, and I think that it's so I'm not sure if something that I've been thinking about often is, right, how do Asians what are some of the ways that Asians can step up for the Black community and the work that has been going on, right? What are some types of state violence Asian American communities can or need to show up to the struggle with? And I do want to highlight, right, some of the work that BYP does, and I'm curious as to whether or not BYP does work with Asian American orgs, or if Asian American organizations have reached out to BYP to work or collaborate with. So Fresco, I'm not sure if you can talk a little bit about the work that you do with BYP and sort of the things that you've been doing on the ground, and what are some ways that, right, folks in the Asian community can step up.
So BYP exclusively and intentionally works with young Black people. We believe that historically the ways in which we have combated anti-Blackness from all different groups of people, not just white folks, have been to create exclusive space to build with young Black people, to mobilize, cultivate the analysis, and develop the leadership of young Black folks, and rebuild a sense of community, a sense of family, and a sense of support within Black community exclusively. We have built campaigns and actions. Excuse me, I'm sorry. We worked on, to speak to state violence, we worked on an action in Chicago around Thanksgiving, a little before Thanksgiving, against the International Association of the Chief of Police, where we blockaded the entire convention. It was an international convention for police chiefs to share tactics on how they incarcerate and deportation, incarceration, and the criminalization of all non-Black people. And so we built action to shut the conference down, in which we worked with Asian American groups, we worked with undocumented folks, and we pulled folks in and worked in coalition, in a huge coalition to shut that down, making a commitment to work in solidarity with other groups that believe and understand that they have to operate through an anti-Black lens instead of a white supremacy lens. And we've committed to show up for these groups of folks, and they've committed to show up for Black folks.
So any other thoughts on ways in which, right, thinking about New York context, right, ways in which that Asians can step up for Black folks who are who have been on the front lines, right? So Mujin, I'm not sure if Cav or if you have any ideas on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A couple of main kind of points that I came into the conversation hoping I could figure out where to put it was that we need deeper systemic change, right? Like I think many folks in the Chinese and larger Asian American community are calling attention to the undertraining and to the racial bias against Asian officers within the NYPD. And although we encourage that interrogation of the way that the NYPD trains its folks, their policies, and stuff like that, we also know that these same policies and practices are what have led to killings of folks such as, in the case of Akai Gurley. But the problem, we understand that the problem is not just like because there's a few bad apples or individual police officers, that the problem is systemic. And, conditions in neighborhoods like East New York, where Akai was killed, which is a neighborhood in Brooklyn, are not incidental. They're, the result of decades actually of underinvestment in community resources. And so I think, one kind of, it's a little more theoretical way in terms of like, I don't have exact, like actions or whatever to be able to point folks to, but, things like housing, things like access to education, employment, stuff like that, are things that we need to be kind of like working together, right? Because at the end of the day, we're fighting as communities of color, more broadly, we're fighting each other for scraps, for crumbs at a table where, there's folks, Wall Street is always pointed to as an example of, folks they have like the whole pie, and we're here kind of fighting each other over these really tiny pieces of that pie. And so and that's why CAAAV believes really, really strongly that we need to hold the whole system accountable, right? Which includes the criminal justice system in order to work towards changing these systems kind of overall. And I think in addition to that, we have to, it's important for us to understand that justice isn't easy. Peter Liang it was decided by a 12-person jury that he was guilty of the top charge of second-degree manslaughter. And it doesn't mean that it's easy. There's folks in the Asian community who, and we understand that there's hurt and frustration by especially Chinese community, but broader Asian American community as well because of this case. And we can and we should address discrimination against Asian communities, but not at the expense of someone who was a father. He was a son, he was a nephew, he was a partner, and he was unjustly killed. So we say like that hashtag Black Lives Matter, and it's also like Akai Gurley's life matters, and justice looks like a lot of different things, but one of those things is to hold the cop who killed him accountable for doing so. And you know, I think in terms of what folks can do to plug in is to not give more attention to the reactionary you know, things that are happening. So for example, the rallies tomorrow, CAAAV is actually and you know, other folks beyond us are asking for folks to not you know, to not do counter protest, right? I'm actually, after this call, going to get on the phone with Akai's aunt because she, you know, she wants to go, and I think to understand that folks are acting based on kind of like emotions, but to give attention to those emotions by showing up and counter protesting, regardless of whether you're standing with Akai's family, is actually not the way. I think a way, there is an online kind of like statement that's going around that we're encouraging different groups to sign on to, just in support of CAAAV, because we've been the most visible, but we have not by no means been the only you know, like Asian group whose standing drum has actually been a part of, you know, like standing with us at an action. When was that, Fahad? Last year, I think.
There's been a few actions that we've joined.
Yeah, together, you know, like standing in solidarity with Akai's family. And so I think, yeah, in terms of support, I think you know, we're organizers, and so organized support, I think also other groups who are interested in issuing statements in support of Akai Gurley and his family. That's one very concrete way of you know, showing solidarity. And in this moment, I think especially in Chinese language media, but other languages as well, that it's we need more voices who are becoming visible on this issue, I think, beyond CAAAV.
I'd like to actually add to that. So I received an email earlier this week from one of the organizers in Chicago of the what they're calling a parade in the Loop tomorrow, you know, usually I get a lot of these emails actually, and usually I just kind of dismiss them and delete them and like not worth my time. But something stuck with me last year talking with a mentor of mine who's been doing this work for several decades, and he asked me why I've never considered actually talking to these people. And he was like, you know, these are our families, these are our people in our networks, and it's really stuck with me, and it's made me think about like, why have I not just kind of, I mean, I know why I don't want to engage with these people in dialogue, because I know part of it is going to feel like slamming my head against the brick wall. But I'm starting to come around, and so I actually emailed the person back, and I was like, you know, can you tell me more about this? Can we, you know, yeah. So they emailed me back that something that I mean, just frame-wise is just so outside of my comprehension. But that's how far apart I feel I am, but I'm not. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not. It's like Diane, you said, these are family, these are friends, right? And so I know one of the questions from Twitter was, how do we counter the rallies? I think that's been answered. You know, drawing more attention may not be helpful. But also, the question going back to how do we communicate with people with a different analysis. Something that I was just thinking about as we were talking about this is I think Asian American young people, the millennial generation, I am not, but certainly people younger than me are just like, I mean, your title is wizard, Diane, social media wizard. But, you know, there's plenty of studies and people saying like Asian Americans like rule YouTube, right? There's tons of millions of people watching Asian Americans on YouTube. And I'm just a thought in my head that I'm thinking is like, you know, I'm not going to be able to break into the Chinese language media. I don't speak the language well enough. But in a lot of ways, the Chinese ethnic media has a monopoly on the messaging and the thinking and the frameworks in this community, but how do we break that monopoly? How can you know, left-minded, progressive-minded folks with social media savvy produce a different media, right? Like, there's all this talk of like, oh, mainstream media doesn't include Asian American, and there's been plenty of cries to just create your own media, produce your own cultural productions. So I think that's just a couple of ideas off the top of my head. I know this summer I'm going to be engaged in interviews with a lot of these people who are probably very sympathetic with the Liang case. It's going to be extremely difficult, but I mean, I think it's just, you know, we do need to start talking to our families and our friends.
Can I just add that I think that part of where we are right now is that two things. One is that we have to take organizing our communities and organizing Asian communities around this issue really seriously because of the threat of not doing it, but also because it's an opportunity in this moment to organize Chinese and Asian communities. And specifically, I think about people like my father, who came here probably in '69, who's not college educated. He is incredibly smart. Didn't trust the police growing up in Korea, had very bad experiences with the police, and the way for me to engage him around this conversation, if he and when he raises questions around fairness, is to actually root the conversation back into what his questions are and really have that conversation. So I kind of want to go back to what Fahad was saying earlier, which is that I think we've got to really build out our political education program on this in a way that's not about translating concepts from English into other languages, but actually meeting people where they are in terms of how they are experiencing not only inequality, but how they're understanding what the situation is right now with Akai Gurley and Peter Liang. I think that we've got to continue to humanize the fact that Akai's life was taken, and his life is just as important as anyone else's. The second thing I want to say, though, is that gives us the opportunity to then talk about some of the history. So for New York City, it means us being able to point to cases like Yongchin Huang from the 90s, where when CAAAV organized around the killing of Yongchin Huang, who was 16 years old and was killed while he was playing, that also helps us link it to the case of Nicholas Hayward Jr., who was also killed in a public housing stairwell when he was just playing in the stairwell right around the same time as Yongchin Huang. And the case of Anthony Baez, who was killed, again, right around the same time. And the fact that the organizing around that case in terms of Yongchin Huang happened with the families of Black and Latino families who had lost loved ones at the hands of the NYPD. So I think we've got to actually not try to translate current whatever concepts we're using, whether it's model minority myth, et cetera, but really be able to engage with people's direct concerns and trace back some of the history that people may or may not know in terms of New York or wherever we're based.
No, I think these are super important points, and especially given the context of a lot of the media that I've seen, especially the Chinese ethnic media, it's a very polarizing narrative that invisibilizes and also dehumanizes the life of Akai Gurley, as well as invisibilizes his family members and the struggles that they're going through. So I think we need to think about ways in which we can build the language and to think of creative ways that we can communicate folks that often don't really make the effort to talk to, right? Like our parents, elderly folks in our communities, and building that bridge. And I think that so for the conversation that we're having today, it will be translated into Chinese so that it's more accessible, right? We'll be adding subtitles so that other folks who don't speak English can understand conversations around anti-Blackness that we're having. I do want to talk a little bit about, so I do want to leave time for questions, and I want to talk a little bit about, so a lot of Liang supporters have pointed to the perceived weakness of the Chinese American community as a political force as support for their claims of Liang being made a scapegoat. And so they say that Liang was made an easy target because the Chinese community isn't really well organized, often making comparisons to how outspoken the Black community is on issues facing their communities. and they bemoan sort of how invisible Asians are in conversations on race, on black-white conversations about race. So how can we reconcile the misreading of black public protests as institutional political power with sort of the feelings of disenfranchisement that many folks in the Chinese and broader Asian American community has felt around Akai Gurley, but also I think even beyond what we're experiencing now?
I think it's really problematic that some of these folks think that the black community has so much more political power or voice. Yeah, that's been something that's really been bothering me. Right. I mean, yeah, Chinese Americans, Asian Americans certainly are disenfranchised politically, like there's no doubt about that, but so are other people of color, clearly. And so to play this like resentment, jealousy, envy game is just not going to help, and is just going to be, it's self-defeating, quite honestly. You know, when you have cases like the one you brought up, the Kang Wong case, these historical cases of Asian Americans facing police brutality and violence and state violence, like in Vincent Chin, when the Asian American community needs to come forward and call for justice, who's going to be here when that happens? Who is going to come to work in solidarity with us? So, yeah, I don't think it's helpful to think about, you know, oh, it's not fair, black folk get more attention, because quite honestly, I don't necessarily think that's the case.
I think one of the things that I would add is, again, to me, it allows a opening into sort of who is putting that message out and what their interests are. In addition to the Kang Wong case, I think in 2011 there was a case of a elderly Chinese man that was beaten in a public park in Chinatown, and at least 2 of the officers that were beating him viciously were of Asian descent. And aside from CAAAV and, like, you know, some of the local folks in the neighborhood, like, there wasn't an outcry about it, you know, from these same sectors. And so to me, it sort of highlights that, you know, there are particular classes, particularly privileged classes that have particular interests, but because they have a lot of resources, they have much further reach on and are able to reach a lot of folks that are within our communities on the ground, and are able to influence them. And so it's on us, the responsibility is on us to be able to be increasing our reach, building larger bases, engaging more people, because in many ways it is sort of getting people, it is a struggle of ideas, and there is, I think, as Joo Hyun mentioned, a lot of historical context that we can point to that allows much deeper and clearer thinking to emerge. But that's really on us, the responsibility on us as organizers to make that happen.
So Fahad, I know that Drum does a lot of work in this context, right? Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which you reach out to folks in the community, right, in Queens, but also beyond, and also how you ensure that folks stay engaged?
So I think I was going to step back because I think the last time Joo Hyun spoke, she mentioned essentially a lot of sort of the talking points I would have used. But we work with where people's own day-to-day struggles and realities are. So people that are being targeted by NYPD surveillance, people that are being targeted by police harassment, people that are being targeted as workers, people that are undocumented. We use people, you know, that are dealing with their own struggles to bring them in and say, all right, let's start to organize for the struggles that you're facing. But we are also very intentional about making sure that we're doing political education, that we're doing relationship building with other communities and other mass spaces. And through that, we also open up a space for people to talk about, okay, given now that we've learned these things and you've met with and built relationships with these other communities, how does that make you question how you shape your own struggle? And for us, I think this is a little bit going back to the question earlier of solidarity. You know, there's one thing around like supporting Black leadership, but there's also a question about how do we shape our own struggles? Because a lot of times we shape our own struggles in ways that undermine other communities. And so I think a couple of examples that come to mind is, you know, a lot of the folks that we deal with we organize are undocumented immigrants. South Asian undocumented immigrants, by and large, come here on visas, overstay visas, and become undocumented that way. But having done exchanges with Afro-Caribbean members of Families for Freedom, many of whom are targeted, over-policed as a result of being Black, and then sort of become caught up in the criminal immigration deportation system, are now facing deportations. A lot of relationship building with Latino immigrants who crossed the border and lost loved ones due to militarization of the border. And through that relationship building, a lot of our members have developed a level of solidarity where they actually refused immigration proposals which would benefit them, but would be to the detriment of Latino and Black immigrant communities. I mean, by and large, I say our community would not have been negatively impacted by the last Senate immigration bill as much as other communities were. But because of the relationship building that's being done, people start to have a perception of solidarity, which is very, very different, to where people will say that I don't want immigration papers if they're tainted with the blood of my sisters and my brothers. So for us, again, it's about going into the communities, taking issues that impact them. But if we do the proper development, it allows us to resolve the contradictions that often arise across our communities through how we shape our own struggles. So that allows us to both engage our own people, but also do it in a way that allows us to build links and solidarity in genuine ways across other communities.
Yeah, I think that's super important, right? Thinking about what it means to build relationships over time, especially at the everyday level, and how they're sustained, right? And that kind of leads me into my next question, because ever since the Peter Liang trial has started, a lot of us have been thinking about what justice means in our current system versus what it could or should look like. And so I'm wondering, you know, this goes out to everyone, and I'm also super curious about what, I guess if PYP has a stance on this, Fresco, so what your vision of justice and liberation looks like in the work that you do. And yeah.
So we believe in prison abolition. We are an organization that holds like the diversity of Blackness and the different routes of liberation at which different Black folk envision moving us through. So we believe in this. We believe that the state needs to acknowledge the murders of Black folks. The state needs to acknowledge the genocide that that Black folks have gone through for years. This country and this world needs to acknowledge that it has benefited and has moved forward throughout history on the backs of Black folks. And we want Blackness to be decriminalized in America. And that's what Black liberation looks like. So it's been interesting. If you notice, we don't necessarily fight for a calling for people to be arrested. In Chicago, which is where I am with the Chicago chapter, we have called for the firing of police officer Dante Servin that killed Rekia Boyd. We want the police department, police unions in the city of Chicago to acknowledge that these are not acts of misconduct, these are murders. And these murders are state violence that that follows a long line of slavery, and when I say slavery, not just the exploitation of labor, but the taking on identity of slavery connected with Black folks throughout generations, and what that means when Black folks interact with the state and the state violently interacts with us. And we want to, and justice for us doesn't look like folks being funneled into the prison system. Justice for us looks like Black folks not being killed, murdered, and disenfranchised.
That's incredible. PYP has chapters in how many cities or regions right now?
We will be working in 10 states this year, but we have 7 chapters so far. We have an Oakland chapter, Oakland, Chicago, New Orleans, Detroit, New York, DC, and North Carolina.
Wow. And so for folks in New York, do you see a similar sort of prison abolition framework in your organizing, right? So thinking about the work that DRUM does, that CAAAV does, that CPR does.
Absolutely. Most of the young people, again, we work with young Black people between the ages of 18 and 35. Most of the young Black people that are in the New York chapter worked on, I shouldn't say most, but many of them worked on the Columbia Prison Divest campaign with Columbia University. And so they believe in divestment from the prison system, and that we have to abolish prisons. We have to abolish prisons in order to achieve Black liberation, because part of the enslaving of Black identity means the harsh, violent, and heavy policing of Black bodies. And so, yes.
And so, Joo Hyun, I know that you do a lot of work with making systemic change in the NYPD. Is this a framework that your organization works with? And yeah, so thinking about working towards prison abolition, is this something that you speak to organizations that are part of your coalition? How do you engage this language at all?
Well, Community United for Police Reform, as you know, is a coalition. So it's a coalition of over 60 organizations formally, and then another probably 60 partners. Some of those are, and they run the gamut in terms of on this question. Some of them do identify organizationally as prison abolitionist organizations, and a lot don't. And so this is an area where we've got to do, I think, but this is an area where we need to do additional work internally, but I wouldn't say, I don't think it would be fair for me to say that all of the organizations within CPR by far are of one tendency or another. And that's actually part of the work for us in terms of not making everyone think the same all the time, but really trying to move organizations in a direction that's more liberatory. And I just want to get to your other question, I think it's important to think about how we're framing our work moving forward, all of us, around police accountability in ways that do move towards safety, that doesn't rely on law enforcement entirely, that does look to full housing, that does look at full employment, and other issues that are vital to just community survival.
I can add just a little bit. I think if you were to look at our work, we do take an abolitionist framework in a lot of our work, so around the school-to-prison pipeline, trying to end that, around policing on the streets, around surveillance, around immigration enforcement. In our, but I think at the same time we are one of the organizations that stood out around the conviction and pushing for the conviction and accountability of Peter Liang. Right, and so in some ways there's a contradiction there. I think the way that we've tried to understand it, and at least where the conversation is at now amongst our membership, is we are definitely working towards prison abolition, abolition of police and prisons, but the priority in that is fellow other communities, and that we have to be able to distinguish other communities and systems of power. So for systems of power, we are very much taking a accountability approach, but for our other communities that we want to use restorative justice and other ways that do not resort to police and do not resort to prisons as a solution. And I think I think we are clear that there's contradictions in that thinking and things that need to be resolved. But I think that's part of the ongoing struggles and discussions that our communities need to have as we struggle for justice.
Yeah, I think this is so important. I'm hoping that this can be part of a larger conversation, but thinking about ways that we can think more broadly about prison abolition, but also draw connections with sort of our visions of liberation and justice and how it's really all tied together, right? And so we're sort of getting to the end of our conversation. I do want to leave some time for questions and answers. And so we got some questions from Twitter. The first one is, so this question goes out to everyone on the panel. How can we address the lack of discussion on Asian American participation, including activists, right, in capitalism, a fundamentally anti-Black and imperial structure? So any thoughts on that?
I would go back to just some of the earlier conversations. I think like starting out a conversation with, how do we organize against capitalism is, may attract some activists, but by and large in the community that may not be a starting point. And so we have to meet people where they're at and kind of based on what their needs and what their struggles are, engage with them around how do we shape those struggles in a way that is not just about our own self-interest, but actually works towards undoing the larger systems of oppression and injustice, including capitalism, including imperialism, that bind us all.
Hey, this is Fresco. So moving through an anti-Black lens with your work, the idea that when Black folks get free, all folks get free. We take a Black queer feminist approach to our organizing, which says that like when you focus your organizing on the most marginalized folks and you dismantle the systems that are oppressing the most marginalized folks, the reaction is that all the folks that are then are in different places in the ladder to access, but are still marginalized, just not in the same ways as those most marginalized folks. They also get free. And so like not being afraid to center your work in the dismantling of anti-Blackness as opposed to the dismantling of white supremacy, so that we all get free and not just Black folks.
So so the final question, we do have to wrap up soon. A lot of questions have been asked about, right, access and communication with folks who are most marginalized in our communities to understand concepts like, right, connected liberation, anti-Blackness, what it means to be a model minority, building those tools so that we can communicate with each other. So I guess this question goes for each of the panelists. Before we wrap up, could you each sort of give me an idea or something that you've been thinking about in terms of ways that you or your organization gets past or can move towards better conversation, but also mutual understanding of what it means to build solidarity and organizing, right, around especially Peter Liang's conviction. So I know that CAAAV, Mijin, right, this is something that CAAAV has been talking about a lot, ways to build language, I guess, language accessibility and justice. Do you have anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in response to that question, I would go back to a lot of what Fahad has been talking about in terms of the way that they build, that drum builds their base and that they build with people is, you know, not coming from this like ideological, you know, meeting folks on the street and saying like, hey, or maybe not on the street, but, you know, like meeting folks in community and saying, hey, do you want to come and like dismantle capitalism with us? Maybe not the way to kind of like get folks, but you know, like knowing kind of where someone is at, especially if he's meeting them in community and saying like, hey, you know, like, do you want to come and address the issues that you're facing, you know, on a daily basis as someone who lives, you know, in this particular identity in this particular neighborhood. I think CAAAV, that's also the way that we, you know, build a lot of our membership, right? Is we're meeting folks who are struggling kind of with like housing issues, with you know, different things, and we're organizing them in kind of like building tenant leaders, and you know, folks are making decisions in their own way about how to move forward. And I think in the case of Peter Liang, I think in terms of it's slightly different, right? Because we're reaching out. I mean, because I feel like, and I said it earlier, but I think I want to reiterate that we're really working to like center and amplify, you know, Akai Gurley's family, who is a Black family, and kind of like just stand in solidarity and support and do whatever work or you know, kind of try and meet some of their needs. And so I think I want to go back a little bit to like what the question of like, what does justice really look like? And for me, justice, you know, there's the courtroom scenario, and there's also, you know, like supporting Akai's family, his partner who doesn't have, you know, like that double income anymore. She has 2 young children, making sure that her daughters are able to have like birthday celebrations. I think, you know, like kind of talking to various family members and making sure that communication is flowing between like various folks who may not have even like known each other or talked to each other as much before Akai was killed. So I think all those kind of invisibilized things, to me, that's what justice looks like, regardless of whether you know, you're a prison abolitionist or not, is like kind of seeing that at its root, you know, like when a life, at least when a life is taken, right? When a life is stolen, people, you know, there's needs that arise, and I think also working towards making sure that people's lives are not, especially like the lives of Black folks are not taken anymore, or not stolen by police, by the state.
Yeah, and I think this is so important. So thank you, Meejin. And I mean, I kind of want to end on this point because I hope that people can take it in and really, I guess, intentionally think about what it means. So I do want to thank everyone for tuning in to this really important conversation. Let's continue this work. Let's continue the conversation on and offline with our families, in our homes, in community spaces, in other platforms, in more creative ways, thinking about language, access, justice, and translation, right? And so the 18 Million Rising team will be organizing other hangouts on this topic, so definitely stay tuned. And many thanks to the panelists who took the time out today to join me in having this conversation. So really, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting us.